Good evening and welcome to Unfractured, a special community conversation presented by Vermont Public Radio and Vermont PBS. I'm Connor Cyrus.
And I'm Jane Lindholm. Today marks the one-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department. Former officer Derek Chauvin was convicted of Floyd's murder last month. He's expected to be sentenced in June.
George Floyd's murder was filmed by a bystander and viewed by people around the world in the days and weeks after his death. That motivated protests throughout the pandemic summer in big cities and small towns. People coming together to demand dismantling of a system that privileged white-skinned people over people of color. All BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, have long been fighting for change. Floyd's death spurred more white people to take action as well.
Vermonters have been grappling with how to address systemic injustice, racism, and policing too. Protests took place all over the state in the last 12 months. Community members in Burlington gathered in 90-degree weather to paint Black Lives Matter in huge orange letters on Main Street last summer. But tensions continued to simmer as well. A similar mural painted in Montpelier was defaced in June. Governor Scott asked state officials to look into the matter and later directed transportation workers to remove anti-BLM graffiti in Jamaica.
Today in Vermont, Governor Phil Scott signed a proclamation to make May 25th George Floyd Remembrance Day in Vermont. Here's what he had to say during today's press conference.
Mr. Floyd's death 1 year ago was a murder under the knee of a law enforcement officer who swore to keep us safe. His death was tragic and importantly sparked a national conversation about how to address racism, modernize law enforcement, and more. I think it's important we reflect on what we saw with our own eyes on this anniversary and make sure we continue this work, which is why it was important to mark today with a proclamation.
On this anniversary of George Floyd's death, we're going to spend some time tonight coming together as Vermonters to talk about what has happened over the past year and to share what we want to see moving forward. Specifically, we want to look in this program at the role the media plays in perpetuating and addressing systemic racism.
The work hasn't stopped for many activists fighting for change to bring an end to white supremacy. The pain, racism, isolation that comes with being Black, Indigenous, and a person of color in Vermont only makes conversations like the ones we'll have today nothing short of emotionally taxing. And I want to take time to acknowledge that. As a Black man, I know that today is hard. So I just want to give a special shout out to all of my Black brothers and sisters that are listening. I see you and I hear you.
I appreciate that, Connor. And as a white person and white woman, I haven't had the same struggles, but I appreciate that this conversation is part of listening and part of coming together. Coming up, we'll hear from the co-presidents of the NAACP Vermont chapters to get their thoughts on how Vermont media has done in telling stories of Black people and what they'd like to see moving forward. We'll also chat with a media critic from Northern Vermont University to get a broad picture of what she has observed changing or in need of change in the Vermont media landscape.
We also want to hear from you throughout this hour. Did you see yourself reflected in media coverage this past year? As media organizations reckon with race and news coverage, as well as the internal questions about diversity and inclusion, how could we do better?
You can give us a call if you'd like to participate in this hour-long conversation. Our number is 1-800-639-2211. Or you can send an email to community@vpr.org. That number again, 800-639-2211 or community@vpr.org.
But before we dive into media issues, we want to take a few moments to hear about some of the events that have been happening today around the state. VPR's Peter Hirschfeld attended a walkout at a school in Morrisville, and he is now in Putney, where a group of people have gathered in remembrance of George Floyd. Peter Hirschfeld joins us live. Peter, thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Really good to be with you, Connor and Jane.
Pete, can you give us a breakdown of what's happening right now in Putney, where you are here live at 7 p.m.?
So I am standing on a little green in the village of Putney. I would say about 30 people have gathered here so far, though there are more folks arriving every minute. There are some banners, there are some signs. I see a banner that says, "Be the change we need to see." I talked with Putney Representative Michael Merwicki, who is one of the organizers of this event. He said he wants to use this moment to remember George Floyd, to memorialize the man, but also to contemplate what white allyship ought to look like in Vermont as we move forward.
Peter, you've been to several events throughout the state that have taken place today to remember George Floyd. Tell us about the event that you went to today in Bristol.
Yeah, this was another event organized by a state representative, Bristol Representative Mari Cortez. The legislature's Social Equity Caucus actually asked its lawmakers to hold these events on the one-year anniversary of George Floyd's death. About 40 people showed up for that. It was a really quiet, contemplative time on the town green in Bristol. Folks formed a circle, had a moment of silence and reflection for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, which we all know the significance of at this point in time. Just before that moment of silence began, Bristol resident Ruth Farmer, who was the only person of color at this event, offered her thoughts about the significance of this day and this moment.
I was listening to Dr. Michael Curry's sermon at the Washington National Cathedral, and one of the things that he brought up was that we need a revolution in this country. And I can say that probably people will say, maybe no one will take pictures of this and maybe no one will cover this, but this is a revolution.
Connor and Jane, that sermon that Reverend Curry delivered that Ruth Farmer was talking about, I asked her about it after, and she said, I want to be clear, the revolution he talked about was a revolution of love. And I went back and listened. Reverend Curry said it was a revolution of love, a revolution of compassion and goodness and justice and right and human decency and kindness. And Ruth Farmer said, that's the revolution that she wants to be a part of, and that's the revolution she sees forming in the wake of this national reckoning that was sparked by George Floyd's murder. She says she's really optimistic right now that this revolution is on a trajectory towards something meaningful.
She is optimistic, Pete.
She really is. And that, I would have to say, is a sentiment that I've heard from the vast majority of people that I've spoken to today, while acknowledging the horrors of racism and systemic racism and police brutality. Folks feel like the last 12 months have been a time of a kind of change and transformation that they're not accustomed to seeing on this issue, at least.
You know, you characterized the situation in Bristol where you were earlier today as somber in some ways, silent. And it sounds, pretty quiet behind you in Putney right now, although that may change later in the evening. But I'm curious if that's in contrast or similar to what you saw in Morrisville, where you witnessed one of several walkouts in high schools around the state. What happened at People's Academy in Morrisville?
Well, they're teenagers, Jane, so they were a little more buoyant and joyful. But I wouldn't have called the mood celebratory there either. About 40 students walked out of People's Academy at 2:30 p.m. this afternoon, walked about a half mile down to the main intersection in Morrisville, and held banners, signs, just wanted to have this moment of visibility to acknowledge this significant anniversary. I talked to some of the students who are out there, and one of them said, this past year has really brought into sharper focus for them the reality of racism, what it means for this country, and also the privilege that she enjoys simply by virtue of being white. Some of the students I talked to said, this is a moment that's sort of for show in some ways, but they said for them, action moving forward is not just going to be acknowledging the privilege that they enjoy, but talking to people in their spheres of influence to try to change racist attitudes among family and friends and community members that they have some stock with.
Now, we want to hear from you, and we want you to be part of this conversation. The number that we're looking for you to call is 1-800-639-2211, or send an email. What have you experienced when it comes to how the media has covered race in Vermont? And do you see yourself when you hear these stories and when you see these stories in Vermont media? Now, Peter, I want to ask you, does the tone of the conversation seem different when you speak to high school kids versus adults when you're having these conversations about race and white privilege here in Vermont?
It's funny, Connor. It doesn't substantively. What I hear people saying is that this last year regardless of their age, has expanded the horizons of their minds in a lot of ways, illuminated truths that they had sort of had a slight awareness of before, but not nearly as acutely as they've come to understand right now. They also talk about understanding that racism is not this overt phenomenon, or it's not always this overt phenomenon that's limited to slurs and hate crimes, but that racism and systemic racism is a cultural legacy of this country, right? That is infused in people and institutions in ways that a lot of Vermonters are just beginning to understand.
When you mentioned just beginning to understand, how far back does that unfolding, that reckoning and awakening go back, Pete? I'm curious, you covered the immediate reaction to George Floyd's death last year. And throughout the last 12 months, you've been looking at issues of race and racism and calls for social justice. How would you characterize differences in the tone or calls to action from last summer to today?
When I was attending rallies and protests last summer, the clear and obvious message was indictment of police brutality and condemnation of the ways in which racism has infused police agencies and other government institutions, and real cries for immediate change. What I've been seeing and hearing today is more of a desire to memorialize George Floyd, the man, to think about who he was, what he contributed as a human being to his community, and also contemplate what activism ought to look like as we move forward in order to create a legacy from that tragedy that people can look back on and be proud of.
And as we talk about moving forward, how do you see, if at all, what do you see shifting in Vermont media when it comes to how Vermont media and news organizations discuss race?
Connor, I think Vermont media has come to appreciate the importance and value of diversity in its newsrooms in a way that it maybe paid lip service to previously, but never seemed to actually act on. And that the people that are leaders in Vermont media, I think, are beginning to come to understand that our news institutions can't hope to cover issues of race and racism unless and until our journalists reflect the diversity of the communities that we're trying to serve. And I think there's people are feeling more of a sense of responsibility to actually move forward with action on that front instead of sort of perseverating about it and figuring out how are we going to do this.
Now, Peter, on a personal level, I want to know, has your approach to how you talk about and report people of color, has it changed in the past year? I mean, I know that you covered, protests and rallies in Newport and all over the state. So how has your approach to covering this topic changed?
Yeah, Connor, I look back at some of the stories that I've done in the past on racial justice issues and see so many things that betray my ignorance and incompetence, and realize the need to do a lot better than I have. As you know, in order to cover issues properly, reporters need to become subject matter experts. And so I know a lot of other reporters have spent a lot of time over the past year talking to people who know a lot more about this stuff than we do, in the hopes that it'll make us better reporters, not just on stories that are explicitly about racial and social justice, but so that we're able to see how systemic racism manifests in other things we're covering, whether it's the environment or the economy or healthcare.
That's VPR's reporter Peter Hirschfeld in Putney this evening. Pete, thank you very much for talking with us. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you both for doing the show, and it's great to be with you.
On this anniversary of George Floyd's death, we're taking a critical look at how VPR and Vermont media have covered race this past year. We just heard about a few events that happened today to remember George Floyd, whose murder sparked a number of protests around the state, around the country, and even around the world. Coming up, NAACP Vermont co-presidents Steffen Gillom and Mia Schultz. Tell us what you see, hear, and read in Vermont's media coverage of race, racism, and cultural diversity. You can give us a call. Our number is 1-800-639-2211. That's 1-800-639-2211. Or share your perspective by emailing community@vpr.org. This is Unfractured, a community conversation on VPR and Vermont PBS.
Welcome back to Unfractured, a special community conversation. Today, we're talking about the role local news organizations play in addressing issues of race in Vermont. But we want to hear from you. Our number is 1-800-639-2211. Again, that number is 1-800-639-2211, or you can email us at community@vpr.org. Again, that's community@vpr.org. But tell us, where do you see good reporting? How do you think the media landscape and media organizations themselves need to change in coverage of race, racism, and social and cultural diversity?
We got a note from State Representative Hal Colston of Winooski, who wrote to say, I am beyond weariness to share or hear experiences of BIPOC's pain and harm caused by systemic and structural racism. What I feel is always missing from the conversation is how are white people impacted from systemic and structural racism? I believe that all of us are wounded by racism. My question for people who identify as white is, what is the cost of whiteness? You can share that perspective. We'd love to hear how you think about that and how you hear whiteness reflected in Vermont media. Again, our number, 1-800-639-2211. That's 1-800-639-2211, or send an email to community@vpr.org.
Now, Vermont is a very white state, and some facts you can't deny. But the whiteness of the state complicates the role of news outlets when telling stories of BIPOC. The Vermont Press Corps is overwhelmingly white, like the state itself, and that influences coverage consciously and unconsciously. It affects the stories that are told and from whose perspective. And when people of color are asked to talk to news outlets, it's often about trauma. Joining us now are two people who have experienced that firsthand and who have stepped up to do the work of speaking out on behalf of Black Vermonters. Mia Schultz and Steffen Gillom with the NAACP Vermont are both familiar with Vermont media, and both are Black. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Now, my first question is going to go to Mia and Steffen. How are the two of you feeling today? Mia, you can answer first.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. Well, it's been, I woke up, we had to make a statement, and we wanted to make sure that people, including especially Black Vermonters, knew that we were in solidarity with them. So while we didn't have any events planned, what we did was together posted a video that we compiled over the last few weeks that really recognized the fact that today is in remembrance of George Floyd and what has happened over the last year in terms of this revolution that we're talking about, but also reflection that there were men and women who have been killed at the hands of police after George Floyd's death, and that those names should be recognized on this day as well, because while we're talking about change today and how we've changed since George Floyd's death, how much has changed, and really let's evaluate that and recognize those people and their humanity as well. So it's really like, going back to how I felt this need to reach out to our fellow BIPOC and Black people in particular to say, we know George Floyd wasn't the first, and we know George Floyd hasn't been the last, and we're all in solidarity for actual change in the system. So it was one of solidarity.
Now, Steffen, when you woke up this morning, was it a heavy day for you, or were you able to take time to reflect on what today is and what this past year has been?
I spent a lot of time talking to my loved ones. I spent a lot of time in reflection, but not necessarily about this day in particular. I spent more time thinking about my ability and the people who look like me ability to emotionally regulate themselves during this time. When George Floyd was murdered, and we saw him being suffocated for over 9 minutes, which if you had the chance to look at the video that we released today, that was silent, by the way, you would get a real grasp just how long 9 minutes is, especially when you are psychologically in a fight or flight mode, right? So you're being pinned down, and 1 minute of going through something like that and that type of trauma feels like a lifetime. So 9 minutes must have felt like a universe worthy, a travel. And a lot of folks have been in that position, myself included. I've been pulled out of the car by police. I've had guns pulled on me. I've seen people who look like me, friends of mine, shot at or bones broken. These are things that people, no matter what stratus or status or proximity to poverty or class, that are Black and then a lot of times brown, have dealt with in the United States when we talk about policing. And so for me, it was really about, how do I spend this time honoring those who are still here, remembering those who have left us, like Mr. Floyd, and thinking about how I'm going to heal past that as a human being and transcend that experience, which is why I'm happy to be here today to speak to you all.
I think that getting up in the morning for a lot of people of color this past year has been particularly difficult because the trauma has just been in everybody's face, white, Black, and everything in between. How do you, as a representative of the NAACP, manage the mental health and your own mental health of a very fragile community here in Vermont?
I think one thing that we do is that we try to meet people where they are. And that's something that I have not seen the media do so much, right? So actually trying to center the experiences of those who have been harmed in a way that feels realistic. Sometimes, though, that means eating up that trauma ourselves, because we're people too. But that's really what it takes. That could be helping people to file a complaint or to type something up, or advocating for them on a level that is so structurally based or systemically based, it almost feels like social work, right? But we're just not being paid for it. There is a real grittiness to this work that people don't really see behind the scenes. And I think all of that, doing those things, being actionable in our intentions, is what contributes to people's mental health. I don't necessarily think it's about having the critical conversations, because it doesn't matter what your background is or what class you grew up in necessarily. If you're the poorest of poor and you're Black and you've had no education, you can still analyze what it is to be Black in the United States much, much better than any the most educated white person. So for us, it's about showing up and not meeting them with that energy. It's about meeting them with action, because who are we to intellectualize their experiences when we're not a monolith ourselves?
Mia Schultz, what has your relationship with the Vermont media been like?
I would call it a little bit complicated, right? Because I don't tend to want to be in the spotlight, but I do want to make sure that messages are heard and that things are said that need to be said. That being said, not all of the things that I've said in my interviews have, especially like television news interviews that are constrained to small minutes of segments, or newspapers, the quotes that they clip have been complicated for me, because it's like, well, that's not really what I was trying to say, and you're really missing a big portion of that really speaks to the system. And I feel like the media has been really making their headway with really speaking about the system over the last couple of years. So that's why I call it complicated. While we need our stories to be told, we need the things to be said, but we need them to be said right, and we need them to be said with the vigor that we use when we're speaking, and when we're talking for systemic change. And I think the other issue that I've found in the media is wanting to paint this picture that everything's good now. We had this, there's a resolution, and that it's over, and now we have this equity statement, or we have this solution that you think is done. But when you're talking about systemic change, it's something that needs to be checked over and over and over again, and it doesn't always come out with roses and smelling good. So while I want the message out there, and I appreciate having our voices being lifted up lately, especially lately, I also recognize there's a lot being left unsaid that's kept out of the narrative.
What do you want to say that's unsaid? I mean, this is a live conversation, which in some ways doesn't solve the problems, but also offers an opportunity for your voice to be unfiltered, to say what it is that you want to say. What is missing that you want to make sure is out there?
The fact that, Vermont is not exempt from systemic racism, and that Vermont is not white on accident. I think the founding president, Tabitha Moore of my branch, Rutland area NAACP, coined that publicly, but we all knew it for many, many years that Vermont is not white on accident, right? And we've been saying that, and just recently that was, for example, something that was published. We have been calling for accountability in real ways, and that means like removing people from office who have been barriers to systemic change, and to say those things. So if I'm talking about Bennington, I'm going to talk about the police chief and the town manager and those people who have been neglectful in their duties, and a lot of times people don't want to speak about those things. So there we go. I got to say it here.
Now, Steffen, I'm curious, to go back to what Mia was saying, when we talk about, Black people, we have been talking about these issues for a long time. And how does it feel to have white people now catch up to the conversation that we have had in our own community for such a long time? And are you seeing change with it now that we have more white people a part of the conversation?
I think that's a complicated question. I would say that I have not seen the change that we are hoping for, especially in Vermont, because of the fact that a lot of it is performative. And I think a lot of folks of color know that these conversations are performative. They are, curated by white people, and they are made to impress other white people and to advance and to keep hold of structural power. Because if I'm a woke person, quote unquote, then I am not fireable. I am not problematic. There really isn't a lot of movement that we see that is meaningful when we think about people actually getting out of the way and making space for others. Everybody talks about it, but nobody really does it, right? Look at the makeup of our legislature. Look at the makeup of our economic core in the state. Look at our landowners. If you talk to them, everybody talks a good game, but who actually is actionable? That action is put on the back of people of color, like Mia and I and so many others. And we are the ones who are tasked with carrying that torch and creating our own structural power that is often and minimized and or wielded to people's benefit. And so I think that to be an advocate for justice, but especially racial justice, with the background that we have in the United States, you have to be a complex and multiplex person and really be able to sniff out the bullcrap, honestly, as it comes. I would also say, when it comes to the media, and I think that Peter had spoken a little bit about this earlier, there's this emphasis on time. And we don't talk enough about how time truly impacts bias. There have been lots of Harvard tests now that show the intersection of time and bias and how horrible of a combination that can be when it comes to lives, Black lives. But one thing that it misses, particularly in Vermont, is nuance. When you focus on getting the story out, one story after the other, getting it out, you become a biased reporter, and you clip things that sound sensationalized, and you miss and you erase the nuance that is so important. And I will also add that while we see this lack of nuance happening and this over-sensationalization happening within, the Black and Brown communities and around the justice spaces, we don't necessarily see that when we talk about policing. We see a lot of nuance there, even though we have no idea about what's happening in those four walls and the conversations that are being had. All we know is what's being reported out to us most of the time. So to me, it feels incongruent, the treatment of the people who are actually being open books and our messaging, and the treatment of those who have a true institution to protect that is killing Black and Brown people.
Let me put a fine point on that, Steffen. Do you think this conversation in the Vermont media here tonight is performative? And if so, what should we be doing differently or better?
Well, I think absolutely that it's performative. And I think, and the thing about it is it's okay to say that, because we're in a capitalist society where we have to have some sense of performance to make money. And that is the real conversation that we have to have. What we can do better is invite and take the time to really speak about the nuance of a situation and the nuances of these people's lives. George Floyd was, even look at the picture of him. They used the worst picture, the most unnuanced, thuggish picture they could find, when he was a beautiful human being who was very well connected and knew a lot of people because of the nuance of his character and the beauty of his character. That was significantly missed. And the media, after a whole year later, has done absolutely nothing to address the fact that he was a holistic, fully fledged human being. And that happens to Black and Brown people all over. So for me, this time situation is important. And also asking, especially when it comes to the queer Black community, let me just qualify that, because the amount of trans Black people that have been murdered and queer Black people that have been murdered is astronomical and never reported. On top of that, I would also say that, we have to talk about not only the lack of centering of those stories, but the fact that the pendulum is swinging nationally. The further we get away from the George Floyd murder, back to systemic protection of law enforcement entities. And we have to ask ourselves, well, really, you have to ask yourself as media, what critical questions are you going to ask to actually get down to the bottom of what's happening in between those four walls, so that we don't have this praxis issue where we have these practices on paper that look beautiful, or in theory on paper that look beautiful, and then we have this action and practice on the ground that's not congruent with these policies that are created, that doesn't erase this bias. These are the questions that we have to ask, that really, I shouldn't say we, that the media has to ask themselves. And they have to ask law enforcement. So I think that this is a multi-pronged approach that has to happen. If I had to be a betting person, I would bet that if we got a little bit more real and we gave a little bit more time and we asked the right questions and actually took a stance as a media towards justice, which means being journalists to those who have that structural power, we would get a lot further than we've gotten.
Mia, I want to ask a question. One of the conversations we had in my newsroom at the beginning of all of this plays into semantics and how we talk about Black people, specifically Black men in the media. And there was a phrase that I think is triggering for a lot of Black people that was said when we talk about George Floyd, and that is unarmed Black man. Can you explain to people at home why that is the incorrect way to talk about Black people, especially Black men dealing with police?
Well, so I guess, well, the first question too is, would you say that when you're talking about a white person, right? Do we say unarmed white man? So semantics is important. You know, the fact that they shouldn't have to be armed in the first place in order to show violence, like, doesn't really track for me, right? They're still a human being. We have armed white men who are detained safely and without being killed. So to qualify it with unarmed Black man, in my opinion now, and I don't really know all of the nuance and where you're really, to be honest, where you're where you're going with this, but to qualify it with unarmed Black man may represent that, well, you know, that means we should fight for that. Well, we should fight for anybody who gets killed by police, right? So whether they're armed or not, I guess that's the only thing that I can think of to go through.
Right, because when we have these, because when we have these conversations, like you mentioned, the assumption is that by using that kind of language, that Black men are armed, and that's the norm. And I think that we, as a media organizations, are slowly understanding the power of the words when it comes to Black people. So I just wanted to get your take as to why these are damaging and why the news organizations need to do better.
Well, yeah, we do need to do better all around with our semantics in general and how we address like just describing our people and people in general, right? So yeah, that's totally something that needs to be addressed in the media and in our everyday conversations, as the nuance of language and how that taints our bias. A lot, in my other role, other than NAACP, I also work with Rights and Democracy as a catalyst leader. And we are like, and not to plug necessarily, but why not? Anyway, we're talking about race and class and dog whistle politics and that sort of thing. And, part of the theory of dog whistle politics is to paint this picture of Black people and people of color in general. And if we remember how Trump came out talking about Mexicans as, and other brown and Black people as thugs, and there's the terms welfare queens and all of those things. They end up being part of our psyche and painting how we see individuals based on the color of their skin.
So when we think about, okay, so what needs to happen now? What is the change that needs to happen in Vermont media in terms of newsroom coverage, but also diversity within newsrooms to make sure that whether it's the language we're talking about, the stories we're covering, the angle we're taking on that coverage, and things beyond trauma when we talk about race and racism, that is actually moving forward? I'd love to get your take, Steffen, on what you think about something like what Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot has done just this past week, saying she won't take any interviews with white reporters for now, at least. She wants to only grant interviews to BIPOC, and saying, there's a problem with the Chicago media. It's too white, and she wants to highlight that. Now, as a journalist, we don't let the people we're reporting on tell us who can cover various stories. But I also see that, there has to be a catalyst for change. And that's perhaps what Mayor Lightfoot is doing if it actually shifts the needle. What do you think about it, Steffen?
I think that what Mayor Lightfoot is doing is the exact example of what happens when you put people who have been through certain experiences and had to work their way up, namely Black and brown people, right, in positions of influence. They are going to make systemic changes that actually benefit, or at least try to benefit, the overall inclusion and narrative of their people. So I think that, I understand this conceptualization of neutrality. I understand why journalists have to have it, but we also have to realize that this was created by white men, and it was created as a way to silence others. Because if you are the creators, if you have the power and you've taken it by force, the best thing that the most influential thing that you can do is to have a state of neutrality, because you get to create what is neutral and what actually makes sense and what doesn't make sense. What questions actually are valid, what ways of being and what ways of process are valid and which ones are not. And so when we see someone doing something that is incongruent with those things, we ask ourselves, well, why would you do that? How is that ethical? And when we think about those ethics, and when we think about the way that those ethics actually can harm people, we should be asking ourselves, how do we follow a good example? And how do we actually modify these things in the ways that are encompassing of the communities who we actually want to center? We know that, and as it was previously stated, that the core of media here is white. And so it's really hard to believe that there is going to be much space, statistically, if we even ran numbers on it, for Black and brown journalism. And so I think what I'm seeing by that is someone trying to sort of flay out the good parts and say, this is the people that we need to be talking to, and this is what we have to be talking to them. And also, I think it's a good use of structural power. And you see folks of color doing this all over the country, right? Stacey Abrams did it with voting, right? Because we understand that even though there's one Black or brown journalist, that the folks at the very top are still white. And so how do we have that conversation?
Yeah, and that absolutely is the conversation that we need to have and continue to have, where it's not just, do you have one journalist of color on your staff, but who's making the editorial decisions, who's helping other reporters make those editorial decisions. And we're going to carry on that conversation as we continue. But I want to thank Steffen Gillom, president of the Windham area branch of the NAACP and executive director of Bright Leadership Institute. Steffen, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
And Mia Schultz is president of the Rutland area branch of the NAACP. And as she mentioned, Catalyst coordinator for Rights and Democracy Vermont. Mia, it was a pleasure to talk with you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you. Thank you, Connor.
Thank you.
And when we come back, we are going to talk more about this. How do newsrooms become more inclusive and do a better job of telling the stories of people who don't look like them? Is a move to change the media from the outside in, as Mayor Lightfoot is doing, the right approach? Is there something that can be done to really spur change within Vermont's newsrooms? And are you seeing that already? Where would you like to see it? What do you want to see? Now's your chance to weigh in on this conversation. You can call 1-800-639-2211 or write to community@vpr.org. This is Unfractured, a community conversation on VPR and Vermont PBS.
Welcome back to Unfractured, a special community conversation on the anniversary of the killing of George Floyd. I'm Connor Cyrus. Tonight, Jane Lindholm and I are looking at Vermont news organizations and representation. Why is diverse racial representation important in a state that's almost all white? Is it important? Given the role news organizations play in shaping the narrative of state conversations and giving people platforms on statewide news shows, how should news media organizations think about internal diversity as well as the editorial process?
What do you think, listeners and viewers this evening? Is your story, your voice represented in Vermont media coverage? Is your life represented? And when it comes to talking about race and racism, what's working for you and what needs to change in Vermont media landscape? You can call 1-800-639-2211. That's 1-800-639-2211. It's okay if you just want to listen tonight as well. Or you can send an email to community@vpr.org.
We now welcome NVU Linden professor and chair of the Broadcast and Digital Journalism program, Megan Meacham. Megan, thank you for joining us tonight.
Connor, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I just want to start, do you have any reactions to anything that Mia and Steffen said today?
So many reactions. I actually really enjoyed hearing their perspective, because I too am not in their shoes. And so for me, as someone who teaches journalism, and as someone who sort of watches all the media in the state of Vermont, it's really interesting to hear the perspective of a Black person in the state. And I completely understand where their frustrations are. I hear it. I'm certainly not in a position to change it, at least, with the media that currently lives in our market. But, my job as a professor of journalism is to hopefully facilitate change for the future generation. But I definitely appreciated a lot of what they had to say.
Megan, as a professor, I'm curious, when it comes to the grade you would give Vermont media in talking about race and racial justice, what grade are you looking at from an A, B, C, D, or F?
Putting me on the spot.
Putting you on the spot as a former professor.
And Connor, isn't she your former professor as well?
Yes, she is.
Yes, I am. I think if I were to look at Vermont media over the last year, their performance has had ebbs and flows, for lack of a better way of putting it. In a lot of cases, they've highlighted some very important issues and gotten conversations started. But in others, I think we've lost momentum. And it's sometimes hard to pick that momentum back up. And I imagine for Mia and Steffen, it's really hard to keep that momentum moving forward. So if I were to give it a grade, and that, again, you're putting me on the spot, so it's not super fair.
How about a pass-fail?
That might be even worse. I don't know.
I would give it a pass. It's certainly not a fail. But I think there's room for improvement, to use an educational term.
Well, let's get into that room for improvement, and I'll read an email that came to me and Connor today from Ross Connolly, who identifies as a 30-year veteran of the Vermont Press Corps and former board member of the Vermont Press Association. His email says, in part, the Vermont Senate passed 3 resolutions last Friday addressing racism. VPR previewed the Senate action Friday morning. A few other media outlets may also have made mention. I don't know how many. The VPR Vermont Public Television broadcast Friday evening, which featured 3 to 4 journalists who covered the State House, reported on the just adjourned legislature. No mention was made of the 3 resolutions. The budget deliberations are reported extensively every year during the session, as are bills relating to the education system, unemployment, jobs, the environment, state pension system. Seldom is an ongoing, in-depth focus on racism and how that is entwined with the many issues a part of the media coverage and discussion. At today's press conference, the governor stated he issued a proclamation that May 25th is George Floyd Commemoration Day. During the question and answer period that followed, only one reporter had questions or comment related to George Floyd's murder. Ross goes on to say Vermont journalists, in his experience, are, quote, good, decent, curious people who do not convey overt negative thoughts about people of color, and yet they make editorial decisions each day as to what merits coverage and what does not. Unfortunately, race relations, racism, and their meaning and actuality in our democracy are seldom explored and reported. I am heartened various media outlets in Vermont and beyond are commemorating George Floyd and taking note of the anniversary of his murder. I'm glad the state Senate acted and the governor issued his proclamation. Will the issues continue to be part of media coverage in the days, weeks, and months ahead, or will the media move on? What do you think, Professor Meacham, about this question of, when and how we look at things through the lens of race?
I think a lot of what Mr. Connolly had to say is very valid. I think one thing that's really challenging in a lot of cases is that a lot of times the narrative that's being driven by reporting is not coming from the reporter itself or themselves, but it's coming from, this is the news of the day, and you're tasked with covering that particular element. And while sometimes reporters do identify that there are other pieces of news that come from one event, like today's press conference, they oftentimes get hidden. And I don't know that reporters necessarily push back enough to get those stories that are just as important up at the same level as what is deemed the news of the day. And so, I actually found it rather important and significant that Governor Scott made point at his press conference today that he made that proclamation. But as I watched the evening news tonight, I didn't see a lot of coverage beyond acknowledging what today is. And that is disappointing.
So what would change if Vermont newsrooms were more racially and ethnically diverse? What would change in the coverage, or even in the way things are covered? Is racial and ethnic diversity the answer, or is it more than that?
I think it's more than that. I think there's an educational component that is important as well. If a lot of reporters in certain demographic areas are not coming from Vermont, right? So if you look at those who are covering the state, a lot of them are not from here. And so it takes time to understand the community in which you're serving and the stories that live within that community. But I think sometimes educating on the important issues like race and diversity should be part of sort of like a welcoming package that a reporter gets when they come into a new community. And I don't know that that's necessarily being done as thoroughly as it should be. And I think that's an area where newsrooms could do better. But to a similar note, I think that there has been some definite shift in diversity in newsrooms in the last year. I would certainly say we're not perfect, but I am seeing more BIPOC faces in our newsrooms around the state, which I think is really important.
We heard from Steffen earlier today, and he spoke about, and Mia, Steffen spoke about time, and Mia spoke about nuance. And that, especially in TV news, that, the day turns are not a lot of time to do that. So how do you fix this problem, or how would you suggest newsrooms handle these conversations when a deadline is so important?
Oh, deadlines are they're the killer, but they're also a saving grace. Saving grace because you don't want to keep things timely, but a killer because I think a lot of what Mia and Steffen were talking about as far as those real messages, they get lost when you're trying to fit it in a 60 to 90 minute piece, or not 90-minute, 90-second piece. I think one of the challenges are finding ways to give reporters a little bit more time to discuss these types of issues and to tell these types of stories, so that they aren't necessarily a day turn, but they're more series related type pieces that allow for a little bit more in-depth reporting, for that longer conversation, which I think with issues like this are really important.
Professor Meacham, we're short on time and we could have this conversation for 3 hours. But so I want to pointedly say, when we think about things like the Black Lives Matter movement and the phrase Black Lives Matter, 10 years ago or so on Vermont Edition, the show I used to host, we made a decision we weren't going to have debates about whether climate change was real and driven by human activity. And we just said that is a given. And that is a stance that felt political at the time. I don't see as many newsrooms today saying we're going to take as a platform Black Lives Matter and start from there. Can news organizations take a stance and say this is what we stand for because there's truth in it and go from there? You know, where do we go with objectivity at this point in 2021?
I think what newsrooms have to do is say, you know, these are the communities in which we serve, and our job is to make sure that even though they don't know what this, you know, that particular topic is about, it's our job to put it in front of our people and to explain those things to our communities. And it's a challenge, and I don't necessarily have the answer on how to fix everything, but I definitely think they could be doing a better job of putting those types of stories into communities so everybody understands better.
Well, yeah, you know, that in many ways is not your job. It's our job. It's those of us doing that work. And this is perhaps just the start of that conversation, or some point early in the conversation, if not exactly the start. Professor Megan Meacham, chair of the Broadcast and Digital Journalism program at NVU Linden, I want to thank you for helping continue this conversation and perhaps spur us to talk about it more. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you both.
And I want to say thanks to all of you who are listening and watching this evening. Thank you for joining us for Unfractured, a community conversation about race and journalism in Vermont.
Today, a special series from Brave Little State starts today. VPR's Myra Flynn speaks with singer Bobby Hackney Jr. of Burlington punk band Rough in the first installment of Homegoings. The series features conversations with musicians of color who live in Vermont. Listen to the interview and follow Homegoings on VPR.org.
Tonight's show was directed by Jake Rusnock. Our production team includes managing producer Lydia Brown and producer Emily Aiken. Our digital producers are Elodie Reed and Abigail Giles. We had production assistants from Dave Rice, Brian Stevenson, Amy Zielinski, Ty Robertson, and Frank Alwine.
On behalf of Jane Lindholm and myself, thanks for listening.